Hey guys. Tonight we are going to travel back to a time that feels both strangely familiar and deeply weird. We're heading to medieval Europe, but not to watch knights jousting or kings holding court. Instead, we're going to witness one of the most bizarre and head-scratching chapters in legal history, a time when animals could be arrested, put on trial, and yes, even executed for their crimes. Honestly, if you were dropped into the world we're about to visit, your first day would probably end with you tripping over a pig and landing face first in what you hope is just mud. It was a different time. So before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. Your support truly means the world. And while you're at it, I'd love to see where you're listening from. Let me know your city and what time it is for you in the comments below. It's always a quiet thrill to see how far these stories travel. Now dim the lights. Maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. The first thing that hits you isn't a sight, but a smell. It's a thick, complicated scent, not entirely unpleasant. Just so, there's the damp, earthy smell of the ground beneath your feet. A mixture of dirt and straw that has been churned into a near-permanent state of mud. Woven into that is the sharp, comforting aroma of wood smoke, curling from the thatched roofs of the small, timber-framed houses huddled together. And under it all, the undeniable, living, breathing scent of animals. Not the sanitized smell of a modern farm, but the raw, close-quarters funk of livestock as your neighbors. Your eyes adjust to the soft, pre-dawn light. This is your new home. A small village somewhere in 14th century France. It's not grand. There are no stone castles in your immediate view. Just a small, sturdy-looking church and a slightly larger stone house on a low hill that you guess belongs to the local lord or his representative. The rest is a jumble of wattle and daub huts, their gardens marked out by flimsy-looking wicker fences that seem more suggestion than barrier. And the animals are everywhere. Utterly, unapologetically everywhere. A flock of geese parades down the main thoroughfare, let's be generous and call it a street, hissing at a stray dog that gets too close. Chickens peck at the ground right outside a family's open doorway, occasionally wandering inside as if they own the place. You have to sidestep a large, hairy sow that's currently using her snout to investigate a particularly interesting puddle. No one else seems to notice or care. This isn't a breakout from a farm, this is just Tuesday. This chaotic intermingling is central to understanding the world you've just entered. In medieval society, especially in rural villages, the line between human space and animal space was incredibly blurry. Most families owned a few animals: a cow for milk, pigs for meat, chickens for eggs. These weren't pets, they were walking, breathing investments. Your entire survival might depend on that one cow making it through the winter. This economic dependence bred a unique kind of intimacy. The animals often lived either in an attached part of the house or in a shelter just steps from the door. In colder months, it wasn't unheard of to bring smaller livestock inside for warmth, both for them and for you. Now, this setup created a very specific legal and social landscape. With animals constantly underfoot, disputes were inevitable. Whose pig just dug up my turnip patch? Whose goat ate the laundry I left out to dry? These were the real, everyday dramas of village life. As a result, communities had detailed local rules, or customs, that dictated fines for such transgressions. This is a key historical point. Society was already well practiced in holding the owners of animals accountable for the damages they caused. It was a simple, logical system. But here's a little detail that adds a layer of strangeness. In some regions, there was a practice known as pillage, where villagers had the right to let their pigs roam in the lord's forests to fatten up on acorns and fallen nuts before winter. This wasn't just letting them loose, it was an established, often paid for right. Imagine a world where it's not only normal for pigs to wander the village, but it's a formal part of the economy to have them wandering the woods, too. Animals were truly integrated into the very fabric of the landscape and the law. And this brings us to a point that historians still puzzle over. How did medieval people truly feel about this constant, messy proximity? Was it a pastoral ideal, a harmonious living with nature, or was it a constant, smelly, frustrating nuisance? The truth, as is often the case, seems to lie somewhere in the middle. Surviving court records and town ordinances are filled with complaints and regulations trying to manage the chaos. Rules about keeping pigs out of the graveyard, or preventing cattle from fouling the town well. So, while they accepted this coexistence as a fact of life, they weren't always happy about it. The exact emotional texture of this human-animal relationship, that blend of dependence and annoyance, is something scholars continue to debate. You start to get a feel for the rhythm of the place, the slow pace, the constant background noise of livestock, the shared, open nature of it all. You lean against a rough-hewn fence post, watching the village slowly come to life as the sun climbs higher. You think you're beginning to understand. But a sound from across the small green shatters the morning's routine. It's not the usual clang of the blacksmith or the crowing of a rooster. It's a human scream, a shriek of pure horror. The scream cuts through the morning air like a shard of glass. It's a sound of such raw, primal grief that it stops everyone in their tracks. The geese fall silent. The blacksmith, who had just begun his rhythmic hammering, lets his hammer fall with a dull thud. Heads pop out of doorways, faces etched with alarm. You feel a cold knot tighten in your stomach as you, along with everyone else, turn towards the source's small, rather neglected-looking cottage on the edge of the village green. People begin to move, not in a panicked rush, but in a slow, hesitant tide of dread. You join them, your boots squelching in the ever-present mud, a low murmur rippling through the small crowd. As you get closer, the crowd parts, creating a grim corridor, and then you see it, on the ground, near a muddy pigsty enclosed by a rickety fence, lies a small child. There's no need for a doctor to confirm the tragedy. A terrible stillness hangs over the small form. A stillness that is deeply, fundamentally wrong in a place usually so full of life. A young woman, presumably the mother, is being held back by two neighbors, her body racked with sobs that have no words. And there, standing in the middle of the sty, is the only other living creature in the immediate vicinity. A large, bristly pig. It watches the growing crowd with small, uninterested eyes. It occasionally lets out a soft grunt, nudging a loose stone with its snout. This snout, you notice with a jolt, is stained with a dark, wet crimson. The pig seems utterly unconcerned. It's just a pig, doing pig things, but in the context of the silent tragedy just a few feet away, its placid indifference is horrifying. This is the moment where your modern sensibilities would kick in. You'd think, what a terrible, tragic accident. The poor family, the owner of the pig, will have to pay a hefty fine. Perhaps even have the animal put down. The community will grieve and then move on. But that is not what is about to happen. You are about to witness a profound and, to our eyes, deeply bizarre shift in logic. Here is the crucial historical point in this time and place. What this pig did was not necessarily seen as an accident. In the legal traditions of many parts of medieval and early modern Europe, particularly in France and Switzerland, an animal that killed or seriously injured a human being was considered to have committed a crime, a capital crime. This wasn't just a case of property causing damage. The animal itself was viewed as a culpable agent, a moral entity capable of murder. This idea was deeply rooted in their worldview, drawing its primary justification from the Old Testament, specifically a passage in the book of Exodus which states, "If an ox gores a man or a woman to death, the ox shall be stoned, and its flesh shall not be eaten." For the medieval mind, this wasn't an ancient metaphor. It was a literal instruction from God on how to handle a killer beast. Now for a peculiar little detail that shows just how seriously they took this. The owner of the pig is in a world of trouble. Of course, H.E.S. standing off to one side, his face pale with shock and fear. Not only has his pig caused this horror, but he now owned a murderer. This brought a unique kind of social shame upon him and his household. But the legal proceedings wouldn't just be about him. The official records from cases like this would often include a detailed physical description of the animal, its size, its color, any distinguishing marks, much like a modern police report would describe a human suspect. The animal was no longer just livestock, it had an identity, an official, criminal identity. The villagers are no longer just staring in shock. Their grief is beginning to curdle into something else, a need for order, for justice. This is where we come to a question that historians still vigorously debate. Why did they insist on this elaborate legal process? Why not just kill the pig and be done with it? One theory is that it was a form of collective therapy. A child's death at the hands of an animal is a horrific, random act of nature. By putting the pig on trial, the community could reframe this chaotic event into a structured narrative of crime and punishment. It imposes human order on a cruel and unpredictable world. Another theory points to a deep-seated religious belief that evil wasn't just an abstract concept, it could literally possess a creature, making the animal itself a vessel of sin that had to be ritually purged from the community. Was this justice? Or was it a ritual to cleanse the village of a perceived evil? Scholars still argue over whether the primary motivation was legal, theological, or psychological. A stout man with an air of authority pushes his way to the front. He is the local prelate, a sort of bailiff or sheriff for the lord of the manor. He takes one look at the scene, the grieving mother, the still child, the oblivious pig, and his face sets like stone. He doesn't look at the pig's owner. He looks directly at the pig, and he begins speaking in a low, formal tone, not to the crowd, but to the other men standing with him. The words are about process, about law, about what must be done next. The pig, meanwhile, lets out a contented snort and begins rooting around in the mud for a tasty morsel, completely unaware that it is about to become the central figure in a solemn and utterly surreal legal drama. The prelate doesn't shout. He doesn't need to. His orders are given in a clipped, formal tone that carries an unquestionable weight. He gestures two of the sturdier men in the crowd, men you recognize as part of the local watch. There's a brief, tense discussion. You can't hear the exact words, but their body language tells the whole story. They are being instructed to arrest the pig. The two men exchange a look, not of amusement, but of grim, resigned duty. This is not a joke. This is a formal procedure. One of them disappears for a moment and returns with a thick coil of rope. The other grabs a long, stout pole from a nearby fence. Their approach to the pigsty is slow and deliberate, like two officers approaching a dangerous, barricaded suspect. The crowd, which had been a murmuring sea of grief and shock, falls into a tense, watchful silence. You're witnessing the first step of a formal legal process, the arrest of a non-human. This is where the absurdity begins to crystallize. But for the people here, it's a necessary act of restoring order. The pig is no longer just a pig. It is now, officially, a suspect, a prisoner to be. It has been accused, in situ, of the crime of homicide. In the legal framework of the time, this was the proper and just course of action. They couldn't simply punish it on the spot. There would be a mob lynching. An act of chaos. Justice, even for an animal, had to follow the rules. It had to be seen to be done, and done correctly. The pig, of course, has no idea about the gravity of the situation. As the two men awkwardly climb over the low fence into the sty, it eyes them with mild curiosity. It probably thinks it's about to be fed. One of the men tries to loop the rope around its neck. The pig, suddenly sensing that this is not a prelude to dinner, lets out a startled squeal and dodges away. What follows is a scene of pure, unadulterated slapstick, played out with the deadpan seriousness of a funeral. The two men, slipping and sliding in the mud, try to corner the surprisingly agile animal. The pig, now in a state of panic, darts between them, its squeals growing louder and more frantic. The crowd doesn't laugh. This is a crucial detail. In your time, this scene would be on a viral video compilation titled World's Dumbest Cops. Here, it's a solemn affair. The struggle to apprehend the suspect is part of the process. Their difficulty in capturing the pig isn't seen as incompetence, it's seen as the resistance of a malevolent criminal. The pig's squeals aren't cries of fear, they are the defiant shouts of a murderer. Finally, after several minutes of undignified scrambling, one of the men manages to get the rope over the pig's head and pull it tight. The other uses the pole to guide the now threshing animal towards the gate of the sty. They drag it out onto the village green. Its trotters scrabbling for purchase in the mud. The arrest has been made. Now for a wonderfully bizarre administrative detail. Once arrested, the animal had to be formally imprisoned, and not just tied to a post. In many documented historical cases, the animal was taken to the same place a human prisoner would be held, the local jail. Often, this was a cell in the local castle or courthouse. The town or the lord would then incur the costs of its imprisonment. That's right, the taxpayers had to pay for the criminal pig's room and board. Surviving account books from medieval towns show entries for bread and water for the pig in jail or hay for the horse in the castle dungeon. This created a strange financial reality where the community was legally and financially obligated to care for the very creature it was prosecuting for a heinous crime. The two men begin to lead the pig away, pulling it down the muddy street. And this is where historians still ponder the nuances of the medieval mindset. Did everyone, truly, in their heart of hearts, believe this was a rational course of action? It's hard to say for certain. Some scholars argue that while the legal and religious elite prescribed these trials, the average peasant may have privately thought it was all a bit much. There's a famous account from the 15th century of a man named a goat as his lawyer, perhaps as a satirical jab at the system. However, direct evidence of widespread skepticism is scarce. The official records, written by the very authorities conducting the trials, present a united front of solemnity. So was the average villager a true believer, a skeptic going along to get along, or something in between? We can only speculate. But the public performance of the trial, starting with this arrest, was clearly a powerful tool for community cohesion, regardless of private doubts. You watch as the pig is half dragged, half led towards the small stone building that serves as the local court and jail. The grieving mother has been led away. The child's body has been gently covered and is being prepared for a proper Christian burial. But the murderer, the focus of the community's need for justice, is now in custody. It is being treated not as a dumb beast, but as a legal entity. Its rights, such as they are being respected. It will not be punished without a trial. The wheels of justice have begun to turn, slowly and absurdly, for a very confused and very muddy pig. As the pig is hauled away, leaving a trail of disturbed mud and bewildered silence, you're left standing on the green with a question buzzing in your mind like a trapped fly. Why go through this elaborate, costly, and frankly, ridiculous charade to understand the answer? You have to peel back the layers of the medieval worldview and look at the very structure of their reality. It wasn't just about God, the king, and the peasants. It was about a universe where everything, and I mean everything, was part of a single, divinely ordained legal and moral system. Let's start with the big idea. The central pillar holding all of this up, the concept of a unified cosmic order. In the medieval mind, God didn't create separate rulebooks for humans, animals, and nature. He created one grand, hierarchical system of existence, and everything within it was subject to his law. This is a profound departure from our modern, secular view, where we see humans as the sole authors and subjects of law. For them, law wasn't a human invention, it was a human discovery of divine principles. And since animals were part of God's creation, they were, by extension, part of this universal legal framework. They weren't below the law, they were simply on a different rung of the same ladder. This belief system is why the pig isn't just a pig, it's a vassal of God. A term that sounds strange to us but made perfect sense to them. Like a human vassal who owed fealty to a lord, an animal was seen as having a duty to behave according to its nature within God's creation. When it violently transgressed that rule, when a pig killed a child, or an ox gored its owner, it was seen as a rebellion against this natural, divine order. It was a form of treason, not just against humanity, but against God himself. The trial, therefore, was a way to formally address this breach, to set the universe right again. It was a cosmic administrative task. Now, let's zoom in on a strange and fascinating detail that illustrates this perfectly: the legal distinction they made between different types of animal crimes. They had two broad categories. The first was for individual animals, like our pig, who committed a specific, violent act. These cases were handled by secular courts, the same courts that would try a human for murder or assault. The process was strikingly similar: arrest, imprisonment, trial by a judge, defense and prosecution, and a final sentence. This was a criminal proceeding. But there was a second, even more surreal category: cases against entire species of vermin. Think rats, locusts, beetles, or caterpillars that were destroying crops. You can't exactly arrest a swarm of locusts. So, who handled these cases? The ecclesiastical courts, the church, because these creatures were seen as acting not as individuals, but as a collective plague. They were often considered to be minions of the devil, a manifestation of demonic influence. Therefore, it was the church's job to step in. The legal proceedings were different, involving things like public prayers, processions with holy relics, and ultimately, a solemn, written summons read aloud in the fields, ordering the pests to appear before the ecclesiastical court if they failed to show up, which, shockingly, they always did. The church could proceed to the ultimate punishment: excommunication. They would be ritually cursed and formally cast out from the community of God's creation. This separation of powers: secular courts for individual animal murderers, church courts for demonic swarms of pests, shows just how deeply this legalistic worldview was embedded. It wasn't just a folk custom, it was a structured part of their dual legal system. And this brings us to a debate that continues to fascinate legal historians and anthropologists. Was this a sign of a deeply sophisticated legal mind, applying its principles with breathtaking consistency across all of creation, or was it a sign of a society so trapped in its own legal and religious dogma that it couldn't see the profound absurdity of putting a pig on trial? Some scholars argue for the former, pointing out the meticulous care, the adherence to procedure, and the complex theological arguments that went into these trials. They see it as a testament to the medieval obsession with law and order. Others argue for the latter, suggesting it was a symptom of collective anxiety, a society projecting its fears of chaos, famine, and divine punishment onto the natural world. They see the trials as a ritualistic performance, designed more to reassure the humans than to actually punish the animals. The truth is likely a complex mix of both, a world where legal rigor and profound irrationality could coexist without contradiction. So as you stand there, in the mud and the wood smoke, the initial why begins to resolve into a blurry, complex picture. It's not about one simple reason. It's about a world held together by a belief in a universal order where every creature had its place and its duties. It's about a legal system that saw itself as the enforcer of God's will on earth. And it's about a deep human need to find meaning and justice in the face of random, senseless tragedy. The arrest of the pig wasn't a moment of madness. It was a moment of profound, unshakable, and, to our eyes, deeply alien logic. The pig wasn't just a problem to be solved, it was a tear in the fabric of reality that had to be meticulously stitched back together. Let's follow the road. You trail the two guards and their squealing, reluctant prisoner through the narrow, winding pathways of the village. The destination is a squat, formidable-looking stone building that stands adjacent to the church. It serves a dual purpose. It's the local courthouse and, in its damp, gloomy basement, the town jail. As a human, you would dread this place. It smells of stale sweat, despair, and damp stone. But for the pig, it's just a new, confusing location with strange smells and no mud. The guards shove the pig through a heavy oak door and down a short flight of stone steps. A metal barred door groans open, and with a final, unceremonious push. The pig is locked inside a small, dark cell. The door clangs shut. The prisoner is now secure. And this is where a whole new set of administrative and logistical problems begins for the village authorities. You can't just throw an animal in a cell and forget about it until the trial. The law, in its majestic and sometimes idiotic consistency, demanded that the prisoner be cared for. This is a key point that often gets overlooked in the sensational retellings of these events. The formal process of animal incarceration was taken very seriously. The pig, as a defendant awaiting trial, had rights. It had the right to be kept alive, to be fed and watered. This wasn't out of kindness, it was a legal necessity. You cannot try a dead defendant. So the town was now on the hook for the pig's upkeep. The jailer, a grim-faced man named Jean, now has a new, non-human resident to look after. Imagine the conversation. The private has to formally instruct Jean on his new duties. Jean, we have a new prisoner. A pig. It's accused of homicide. See that it gets food and water twice a day. And Jean, try not to get too attached. The jailer would then have to submit his expenses to the lord of the manor or the town council. Surviving account books from this period are historical treasures, filled with mundane details that paint a vivid picture. You can find entries like item, for the pig in the jail, 6 deniers for bread this week, or paid to the carpenter for reinforcing the cell door, as the sow has been weakening the wood. This leads to a wonderfully strange bit of trivia sometimes. The cost of jailing the animal could exceed the animal's actual market value. A pig might be worth a certain amount at the market, but if its trial was delayed, the cost of its daily rations of bread, water, and maybe some scraps could, over several weeks, add up to a significant sum. There are documented cases where the authorities clearly became exasperated by the mounting hotel bill for their four-legged felon. This created a perverse incentive to expedite the trial, not just for the sake of justice, but for the sake of the town's budget. It was, in a way, the medieval equivalent of complaining about the taxpayer money spent on drawn-out legal appeals. Now, let's talk about the accommodations. The pig is likely in a cell designed for humans. It's dark, cold, and probably has a stone floor and a single, barred window. There's a bucket for water and, well, that's about it. The pig's daily life becomes a monotonous cycle of sleeping, drinking, and eating the meager rations brought by the jailer. It's a far cry from the sensory richness of the village green or the forest floor. It is, by any measure, a miserable existence. And this raises a question that historians and philosophers have debated. Especially in the centuries that followed, did they believe the animal understood its punishment? Did they think the pig in its cell was contemplating its crime, feeling remorse for its actions? The official legal answer seems to be yes. At least on some level. For the trial to be meaningful, the defendant had to be seen as a moral agent capable of understanding right from wrong. The imprisonment itself was part of the punitive process, a foretaste of the justice to come. However, the reality was likely more complicated. It's highly doubtful that the average villager, or even the jailer, believed the pig was capable of complex moral reflection. Instead, the act of imprisoning the pig served a human purpose. It physically removed the offender from the community, quarantining the source of moral pollution. It was a visible, tangible demonstration that the authorities were in control. The sight of the jail, knowing the killer pig was locked inside, was reassuring. It transformed the chaotic horror of the child's death into a contained, manageable legal problem. Whether the pig was learning a lesson was less important than the fact that the humans were restoring their sense of order. The debate over the animal's consciousness versus the trial's social function is a thread that runs through the entire history of this practice. So, while the pig sits in its dark cell, grunting softly, life in the village is already changing. The legal machinery has been activated. Scribes are preparing documents. The private is scheduling a court date. And most importantly, the conversation is shifting. People are no longer just talking about the tragic death of the child, they are talking about the upcoming trial of the pig. The focus has moved from grief to justice, from chaos to procedure. The imprisonment of the pig is the first, crucial step in this psychological transfer. The cell holds more than just a pig, it holds the community's anxiety and the promise of a resolution. Days turn into a week. The pig remains in its cell, a living, breathing, and increasingly expensive piece of evidence. The initial shock in the village has subsided, replaced by the low hum of anticipation. The court date has been set, but a crucial piece is missing. This isn't going to be a simple hearing where a judge just listens to the facts and passes sentence. The system, in its relentless pursuit of procedural correctness, demands something more. The defendant, even a porcini one, has the right to a defense, and that means the court has to find the pig lawyer. You read that right. The next step in this surreal journey is the appointment of a legal advocate for an animal. This wasn't some quirky, one-off event. It was a standard and documented part of the process in many animal trials, particularly in France. The court would formally appoint a member of the local bar to represent the accused animal. It was considered an essential component of a fair trial. To deny the pig a lawyer would be to undermine the very legitimacy of the verdict. Imagine you are that lawyer. Your name is Barthélemy. You're a young, ambitious legal advocate, probably educated in law at a university in Paris or Orleans. You've spent years studying Roman law, canon law, and the dense commentaries of legal scholars. You dream of arguing great cases, of defending the innocent, of making a name for yourself. And one morning, the prefect summons you to his office. You enter, full of professional gravity, and he slides a document across the table. It's a court appointment. Your new client a pig accused of murder. The sheer, soul-crushing absurdity of it is almost too much to bear. All your learning, all your rhetorical skill, all your legal acumen to be placed at the service of a farm animal. But you can't refuse. A court appointment is a duty. To reject it would be a serious breach of professional etiquette, possibly even contempt of court. So with a heavy sigh and a straight face, you accept. You are now the legal counsel for the pig. This practice is one of the most compelling pieces of evidence for just how seriously the legal system took these prosecutions. It wasn't a show trial in the modern sense of a predetermined outcome. The appointment of a defense lawyer implies that there was, at least in theory, a genuine possibility of acquittal. The lawyer's job was to mount the best possible defense for his client, using all the legal tools and arguments at his disposal. And this leads to a fantastic historical oddity, the pig lawyer genre of legal careers. Some lawyers became known for their particular skill in this area. They developed a repertoire of arguments and strategies specifically for defending animal clients. While some may have seen it as a professional backwater, others clearly embraced the challenge. It was a chance to display incredible creativity and erudition, to craft arguments so clever and obscure that they might just win the day. Your first professional duty as the pig's lawyer is, naturally, to confer with your client, so you make the grim, slightly embarrassing trip down to the jail. The jailer, Jane, greets you with a look that's a perfect mixture of pity and amusement. He leads you to the cell, and there you are, standing in front of a barred door, looking at a large, hairy sow that is currently sniffing at a patch of mold on the floor. This is your client. It cannot speak. It cannot offer an alibi. It cannot tell you its side of the story. It just looks at you with beady eyes and lets out a soft grunt. So what do you do? How do you even begin to build a defense? This is where the true genius or perhaps madness of the system revealed itself. The lawyers couldn't rely on testimony from their client, so they had to turn to pure legal abstraction and procedural maneuvering. Their arguments were often masterpieces of creative legal thought. This is a point where historians who study these cases often express a kind of grudging admiration for the lawyers. The question they debate is, were these lawyers cynical opportunists, using these bizarre cases to show off their rhetorical flair and knowledge of obscure legal texts, or were they true believers in the system, Genuinely convinced that these animals deserved a vigorous defense as part of God's order, the tone of the surviving legal arguments suggests a bit of both. There's a clear element of intellectual showmanship, but it's wrapped in the language of sincere legal principle. They seem to be arguing that even if this seems strange, the law must be followed to the letter, and the law demands a defense. You stand there for a moment, observing your silent, uncooperative client. You note its size, its demeanor. You ask the jailer if the pig has been aggressive or docile during its imprisonment. You are gathering facts, just as you would for a human client. You are looking for any angle, any loophole, any argument you can use. You are a professional. You have a job to do. And as you turn to leave the damp, smelly jail, your mind is already racing, sifting through years of legal training. How do you save a pig from the gallows? The challenge is immense. The premise is absurd, but your professional reputation is on the line. You have a case to prepare. While you, Bartholomew the lawyer, are wrestling with the challenge of client communication, the other side is diligently building its case. The prosecution is not taking this lightly. The public prosecutor, a man named Despard, is a zealous and respected officer of the court. He sees this not as a bizarre sideshow, but as a grave and necessary duty to the community and to God. His task is to prove, beyond a reasonable doubt, that the pig in the jail is guilty of the crime of homicide. So how do you build a murder case against a pig? The process is a fascinating mirror of a human trial, adapted for the unique circumstances. Gaspard's first and most crucial step is to secure the crime scene and gather evidence. This was done with formal solemnity. He would have returned to the muddy pigsty, accompanied by clerks and witnesses. They would have documented the scene in writing, noting the location of the victim, the state of the enclosure, and any other relevant details. The most powerful piece of evidence, of course, was the pig itself, arrested with the victim's blood still on its snout. This was the medieval equivalent of finding the suspect with the smoking gun. The next, and most important, part of Gaspard's case is gathering witness testimony, and this is a key historical point. The witnesses were, of course, all human. Animals could not testify in court. The system, thankfully, did not cross. So Gaspard and his clerks would have spent days conducting formal interviews with the villagers. They would have spoken to the neighbors who first heard the mother's scream. They would have questioned the people who saw the pig standing over the child's body. Each testimony would be carefully recorded on parchment, sworn under oath. Imagine one of these interviews. Gaspard, sitting at a wooden table, a scribe next to him with ink and quill at the ready. A nervous farmer is brought in to testify. State your name for the record. Pierre, sir. Pierre, did you see the accused on the morning of the incident? Yes, sir. I saw it. The DLIGNY family cell. And where was the accused when you saw it? It was there, in the sty, near the little one. Did you observe its demeanor? It was just standing there, grunting. There was blood on its snout. Sir, each detail, no matter how small, is noted. The goal is to build an unshakable factual narrative that pig at the scene identifies it as the instrument of death and confirms its guilt. Now for a peculiar and rather grim detail about the evidence. In some cases, the court would order a form of autopsy or examination of the victim's body. A surgeon or a respected town elder would be tasked with examining the wounds to confirm that they were, in fact, consistent with an attack by a pig. They would look at the bite marks, the tearing of the flesh, and present their findings to the court as expert testimony. This was forensic science, in its most nascent and gruesome form, all marshaled for the prosecution of a farm animal. It shows the incredible lengths they would go to in order to legitimize the process and ground it in observable, empirical fact. The prosecution's case rests on a simple, powerful syllogism: a crime was committed. The pig was found at the scene, covered in the evidence of the crime. Witnesses have sworn to these facts. Therefore, the pig is the culprit. From Gaspard's perspective, it's an open and shut case. The pig is a monster, a freak of nature that has violated the moral order. It acted with cruel and savage intent, a phrase often used in the formal indictment. But this raises a profound philosophical and legal question that historians still debate. How did the prosecution handle the issue of mens rea, or guilty mind in modern law, for a crime like murder? The prosecution must prove not only that the defendant committed the act actus reus, but also that they had the criminal intent to do so. Did medieval prosecutors believe a pig could form the intent to commit murder? The records are ambiguous on this. Some legal scholars of the period argued that animals, being irrational beasts without souls, could not form intent. They acted on brute instinct. However, the courts often sidestepped this thorny issue. They operated on a principle closer to strict liability. The act itself was so heinous, so disruptive to the divine and social order, that the act alone was sufficient to prove guilt. The pig's inner state was irrelevant. Its actions had revealed it to be a monster, and for the sake of the community, it had to be purged. This debate whether the animal's guilt was based on its actions or a presumed state of mind is a central puzzle. Was the court punishing a guilty creature? Or was it simply removing a dangerous one through a ritualized legal process? Gaspard, the prosecutor, likely didn't spend his nights agonizing over this distinction. For him, the evidence was clear. He has sworn testimony, physical evidence, and a divine mandate from the book of Exodus. He is confident. He walks into the courthouse, his stack of depositions under his arm, ready to present his case and demand the ultimate penalty. He is there to speak for the dead child, for the grieving family, and for the terrified community, and he will not be swayed by any clever arguments from a fancy lawyer hired to defend a blood-stained pig. Now the ball is in your court. The prosecution has laid out its case, a grim and seemingly irrefutable tapestry of facts and testimony. Gaspard has painted a picture of a savage beast committing an unforgivable act. The court is leaning his way, the community is demanding a conviction. Your task seems impossible. How do you defend the indefensible? How do you argue for the innocence of a client that is, by all accounts, guilty as sin? You can't put the pig on the stand to plead its case. So you do what any good lawyer does: you attack the process. You muddy the waters, and you get creative. Very, very creative. Your defense strategy won't be a single, grand argument. It will be a flurry of legal jabs, procedural complaints, and philosophical queries designed to sound out in frustration. You can't prove your client is innocent, so you have to suggest that the prosecution can't, with absolute certainty, prove it's guilty according to the strict letter of the law. First, you might start with a classic, an argument based on youth. You would march down to the jail again, the grim walk of shame, and this time, you'd be looking at your client with a veterinarian's eye. You'd try to ascertain its age. If you could make a plausible case that the pig was very young, a mere piglet, you could then stand before the judge and deliver a passionate plea based on the concept of non-age, or infancy. This was a real argument used in historical cases. A lawyer named Bartholomew Chasney, a true legend in the animal lawyer world, famously used this defense. The argument goes like this: Your Honor, human children below a certain age cannot be held legally responsible for their actions, as they lack the moral understanding to form criminal intent. My client, this pig, is but a youth, a mere babe in the swine world. Surely the same principle of leniency that we extend to our own children must be extended to this poor, uncomrefined creature. It's a brilliant move. It doesn't deny the act, but it attacks the pig's culpability by appealing to an established legal principle for humans. If the pig is clearly a grumpy old sow, the infancy argument is out, so you pivot. Next, you could attack the legality of the summons or the arrest itself. Was the warrant properly written and sealed? Were the arresting officers acting within their jurisdiction? You'd scour the paperwork for any tiny procedural error, any misplaced comma or misspelled name, and blow it up into a major legal challenge. Your Honor, The warrant names a hairy sow with a crooked tail. As the court can plainly see, my client's tail is merely rakish like earth. This is clearly a case of mistaken identity. It sounds ridiculous, but procedural arguments were the bread and butter of medieval law. A case could absolutely be thrown out on a technicality. Now for a wonderfully weird defense tactic that was actually used: the argument from duress. You could argue that your client did not act of its own free will. Perhaps, you might suggest, the pig was provoked. Your Honor, you'd proclaim with a straight face, we have no witnesses to the very beginning of this tragic encounter. Who is to say the poor child did not, in its innocence, strike my client first? Perhaps my client was merely defending itself from an unexpected assault. Or even better, you could argue that the pig was acting under the influence of other, more aggressive pigs in the vicinity. A sort of porcini peer pressure. It fell in with a bad crowd. Your Honor. This is where we hit a point that still causes debate among legal historians. Were these arguments made with a straight face? Did the lawyers and judges genuinely entertain the idea of pig peer pressure? The historical records are maddeningly deadpan. The arguments are recorded with the same solemnity as arguments about inheritance law. This has led some scholars to believe that this was a form of intellectual game, a display of rhetorical skill where the absurdity was part of the point. Others maintain that in a worldview where animals were moral agents, these arguments about their motivations, however strange to us, were considered legitimate lines of legal inquiry. The lawyer's job was to explore all possibilities, and the court's job was to listen. Perhaps your most powerful line of defense, however, would be a theological one. You would counter the prosecution's heavy reliance on the Old Testament with your own scriptural interpretations. Gaspard quotes Exodus about stoning the goring ox. You counter with the story of Noah's Ark, arguing that God saw fit to save all animals, suggesting they hold a special place in his creation, separate from human justice. You might even bring up the New Testament's emphasis on mercy and forgiveness. Is this court, a Christian court, truly to be guided by the harsh, pre-Christian laws of an eye for an eye, or by the message of grace and redemption? You would be turning the prosecution's own weapon theology against them. These arguments, from infancy and peer pressure to procedural errors and theological debates, formed the core of the animal lawyer's playbook. They are a testament to human ingenuity in the face of an impossible task. You, standing before the court, would be using every ounce of your training not to prove the pig is a good pig, but to prove that the state has not met its sacred burden of proof. Your job isn't to save your client's soul, just to save its neck. And as you conclude your arguments, a flurry of paper and Latin phrases, you hope you've done just enough to plant a single, crucial seed in the judge's mind, the seed of reasonable doubt. The day of the trial arrives. The small stone courthouse is packed to the rafters. It feels less like a legal proceeding and more like a grimly fascinating public spectacle. Villagers have crammed onto the rough wooden benches, their faces a mixture of solemnity, grief, and a morbid curiosity you can feel in the stuffy air. The family of the deceased child sits in the front row, a silent, heartbreaking testament to the reason you are all here. The judge, an old, stern-faced man representing the local feudal lord, presides from a raised wooden chair, his expression unreadable. And then, the defendant is brought in. This is the moment the entire process has been building towards. The heavy oak door at the side of the courtroom groans open, and the two guards enter, pulling and prodding their prisoner forward. The pig, which has spent the last week in a dark cell, is blinking in the light filtering through the high windows. It looks confused and agitated. It lets out a frightened squeal, its trotters slipping on the smooth stone floor. The guards wrestle it into a specially constructed wooden pen in the center of the room, positioned directly between the prosecution and the defense. The accused is now present in court. You are standing at your table, a stack of notes in front of you. Across the way, the prosecutor Gaspard stands ramrod straight, his face a mask of righteous certainty. And in the middle, your client, the pig, occasionally scratches itself against the side of the pen or sniffs hopefully at the floor. The juxtaposition is so profoundly, breathtakingly weird that it almost feels like a dream. The full, solemn weight of human justice, the robed judge, the sworn oaths, the grieving family, the learned lawyers is being brought to bear on a farm animal that is probably just wondering when it will next be fed. The proceedings begin. The clerk reads the formal indictment in a loud, clear voice, first in Latin, the language of the law and the church, and then in the local French dialect for the benefit of the public. The court calls the case of the people versus 1 Sow, property of the DLIGNY family, for the heinous and damnable crime of homicide against the person of Jean, son of Arnaud. The pig's alleged crimes are laid out in excruciating detail throughout the reading. The pig offers a running commentary of soft grunts. Gaspard, the prosecutor, begins his case. He is a skilled orator. He calls his witnesses one by one. Pierre the farmer, the neighbor who heard the scream, the mother herself in a heartbreaking, tear-filled testimony. Gaspard guides them through their stories, building his narrative brick by brick. With each witness, he points a stern, accusatory finger at the wooden pen. And is that the beast you saw? He thunders. The witness nods, and a low murmur ripples through the gallery. The air grows thick with anger and sorrow. Your client, meanwhile, has decided the most interesting thing in the room is a loose floorboard and is trying to pry it up with its snout. This scene, the physical confrontation of the human legal world with the animal one, is the core of the entire phenomenon. It is a live-action representation of their entire worldview. Historians have often noted that the theatricality of these trials was paramount. The public presence of the animal in the courtroom was not just a legal formality, it was a crucial piece of community theater. It allowed the villagers to confront the source of their trauma, to see it contained, powerless, and subjected to the same laws that governed them. The trial was a performance of control. Now for a strange and wonderful little detail about courtroom procedure. During the proceedings, both the prosecutor and you, the defense lawyer, are expected to address your arguments not just to the judge, but occasionally directly to the animal itself. So Gaspard might turn to the pen and say, "You stand accused of a crime that cries out to heaven for vengeance." And you, in your turn, might approach the pen and declare, "I say to you, my client, that the charges against you are unproven and that you are, under the law, innocent until proven guilty." This was done with complete seriousness. The pig's response, usually a grunt or a blank stare, was simply ignored. The purpose of this direct address is another point of scholarly debate. Was it a genuine belief that some part of the animal's consciousness could understand, or was it purely for the benefit of the human audience? A rhetorical device to make the abstract legal arguments more dramatic and personal. The performance theorist in you might argue the latter. It's a way of anthropomorphizing the defendant, making it a believable character in the drama of the trial. By speaking to the pig, the lawyers affirm its status as a participant, not just an object. This reinforces the central, crazy premise that the animal is a legal entity. You get your turn to speak. You stand up. Your heart pounding. You raise your procedural objections. You question the witnesses, trying to find inconsistencies in their stories. You say you saw blood on its snout, but from a distance of 50 paces, in the morning mist. Can you be absolutely certain it was not merely red clay from the sty? You make your pleas for leniency based on your client's youth or provocation. You feel the eyes of the entire village on you. They see you as a trickster, an obstacle on the path to their much-needed closure. But you press on. It is your duty. The climax of the trial is the standoff. Gaspard, in his closing remarks, delivers a fiery speech about community safety and divine justice. You follow with a comma, more cerebral appeal to reason, mercy, and the high burden of proof. The two opposing forces of human law, prosecution and defense, have laid their cases at the judge's feet. In the middle of it all, the pig, tired from the day's excitement, has lain down in its pen and appears to have fallen asleep. The entire weight of the human moral universe has been placed on its back, and it has responded by taking a nap. The surreal confrontation is complete. All that is left is the verdict. A heavy silence descends upon the courtroom. The arguments have been made. The evidence has been presented. The witnesses have wept. The lawyers have declaimed. And the defendant has snored. Now, all eyes turn to the judge. He has been sitting silently through the proceedings. His face a stony mask. His fingers steep lead before him. He is the embodiment of the law, the final arbiter in this strange dialogue between man and beast. His decision will not only determine the fate of the pig, but will also serve as the final, official word on the tragedy that has gripped the village. He does not deliver his verdict immediately. The gravity of the moment requires a certain amount of judicial theatre. He shuffles the parchments on his desk. He clears his throat. He takes a long, slow sip of water from a pewter goblet. The tension in the room is so thick you could cut it with a knife. The pig, awakened by the sudden silence, lets out a small grunt, a comical punctuation mark in a deadly serious moment. The judge finally looks up, his gaze sweeping over the prosecutor. Then you, the defense lawyer, and lingering for a moment on the pig in its pen, he then addresses the court, his voice slow and deliberate, each word landing with immense weight. He begins by summarizing the facts of the case, acknowledging the horror of the child's death and the grief of the family. He commends the prosecutor, Gaspard, for his diligent presentation of the facts. He even gives you a curt nod, acknowledging the learned, if somewhat inventive, arguments you made in defense of your client. This is all part of the formal procedure, showing that he has weighed all sides of the issue. This is the mainstream historical knowledge of the time. The verdict in these trials was almost always guilty. Acquittals were exceedingly rare. The entire purpose of the trial, from a social perspective, was to lead to a conviction and subsequent punishment. It was the final act of the community's ritual of restoring order. An acquittal would have been deeply unsatisfying. It would have meant that the murderer was still in their midst, unpunished, leaving the cosmic books unbalanced. The social and psychological pressure on the judge to convict was immense. He continues his pronouncement. The court has considered the evidence presented. He intones the sworn testimony of the witnesses and the nature of the crime itself. He dismisses your clever defenses one by one. The procedural errors you pointed out, minor clerical issues that do not invalidate the substance of the proceedings. The plea of self-defense without merit, given the savagery of the attack on an innocent child. The theological arguments for mercy misguided. The laws of God and man demand justice, not pity, for such an unnatural act. Then he turns his attention, and the full force of his judicial authority, directly to the pig. Having heard all evidence and argument, he declares, his voice rising, "This court finds the defendant, this cell, guilty of the crime of homicide, committed with cruel and savage intent upon the person of the child G." A collective sigh of grim satisfaction ripples through the gallery. The mother of the child weeps, but this time, her tears seem to be of relief, not just grief. The verdict has been delivered. Justice, as they understand it, is being done. And now for a truly bizarre and specific little detail. In some recorded cases, after the guilty verdict was announced, a court official would approach the animal and formally, officially, inform it of the judgment. It wasn't enough to just convict it, the animal had to be notified. The official would stand before the pen and read the verdict to the pig, as if it were a human prisoner understanding his fate. This act underscores the core belief of the entire process: the animal was a participant, a legal entity from start to finish. The judge isn't finished. The verdict is one thing, the sentence is another. He continues, in accordance with the ancient laws of this realm and the divine precepts handed down to us, this court sentences the condemned sow to be punished by death. He pauses for effect. It shall be taken from this place to the public square and there be hanged by the neck until it is dead. Hanging, not a simple slaughter. This is a crucial distinction. The pig is not to be butchered for meat. The Book of Exodus explicitly forbade eating the flesh of a guilty animal. It is to be executed in the same manner as a human criminal of low standing. The punishment is meant to mirror the punishment for a human murderer. It is a symbolic act, signifying that the pig's crime was an offense on the same moral plane as a human's. The debate among historians here is subtle but important. Was the sentence primarily about retribution, making the animal pay for its crime, deterrence, discouraging other animals from similar acts, or purgation, richly cleansing the community? The argument for deterrence seems the most absurd to modern minds. The idea of other pigs watching the execution and thinking, better not get any ideas. Yet, some contemporary legal texts actually mention deterrence as a rationale. The most likely driver, however, was a mixture of retribution and purgation. The execution was both a punishment for the guilty and a powerful ritual to eject the evil that had manifested in the community. The judge bangs his wooden gavel on the desk. The sound echoes in the silent room. It is done. The trial is over. The guards move to the pen to take the condemned prisoner back to its cell to await its final hour. Your job as a lawyer is finished. You did your best, deploying all the tools of your trade. But you were arguing against the combined weight of grief, faith, and 1,000 years of legal tradition. As you gather your notes, you watch your client being dragged away. It looks no different than it did when it arrived, just a confused, frightened animal, completely oblivious to the fact that it has just been solemnly, legally, and irrevocably condemned to death. The verdict has been handed down, and the sentence is death by hanging. It's a grim, formal end for a pig, but hanging was just one of a whole menu of punishments that medieval courts could dish out to animal convicts. The specific sentence often depended on the nature of the crime, the type of animal, and the local customs of the region. This wasn't just random cruelty, it was a structured system of punitive action, every bit as codified as that for human criminals. The goal was to make the punishment fit the crime, ensuring the execution was not just a killing, but a meaningful legal and social ritual. The most common sentence, especially for larger animals like pigs, cattle, or horses that had killed a human, was indeed hanging. This was the standard method of execution for lower-class human criminals, and applying it to an animal was a powerful symbolic statement. It elevated the animal's crime to the level of human murder and subjected it to the same form of ignominious justice. The execution would take place in the public square or on a purpose-built gallows, the same one used for humans. This was justice seen to be done in the most public way possible. However, if the crime was deemed particularly heinous or had connotations of heresy or witchcraft, the punishment could be even more severe. The court might order the animal to be burned at the stake. This was a fate usually reserved for heretics, witches, and those who committed crimes against nature. By burning the animal, the community wasn't just killing it, they were utterly destroying its physical form, purifying the spot with fire, and ensuring that no part of the corrupted creature remained. This was a form of ritual cleansing, a way to fight a perceived supernatural evil. The famous case of the rooster of Basel, which we'll get to later, ended in a sentence of burning for the unnatural act of laying an egg. In some documented cases, the animal was buried alive. This punishment, while less common, was also rich with symbolism. It was seen as a way of returning the unnatural creature to the earth, trapping its evil spirit underground so it could not escape to cause more harm. This was often the fate for animals that had committed acts seen as particularly perverse or demonic. But not all punishments were fatal. For lesser crimes, or in cases where the court was feeling merciful, an animal might be sentenced to exile or banishment. This was more common in the ecclesiastical trials against pests. A flock of sparrows damaging a church garden might be formally warned to leave the parish, and if they persisted, they would be sentenced to perpetual exile. For a larger animal, this was more logistically challenging. How do you banish a horse in some cases? The animal would be driven across the town or parish boundary and legally forbidden from ever returning. This, of course, relied on the rather optimistic assumption that the horse would respect local jurisprudence, And here we come to a wonderfully strange and specific punishment: mutilation as a form of justice. Just as human criminals might have a hand cut off for theft, an animal might be sentenced to a specific, non-fatal injury that mirrored its crime. For instance, a pig that had only injured a person, not killed them, might be sentenced to have one of its legs broken or its snout cut off. There's a documented 14th century case where a bull that had gored a man was sentenced to lose its horns. The logic was clear: the instrument of the crime was being punished and neutralized. It's a form of exquisitely literal, eye for an eye justice applied across the species barrier. This brings us to a fascinating and still debated question among historians: did the animals experience these punishments in a way that was legally meaningful? The court certainly acted as if they did. The punishments were designed to be parallel to human punishments, suggesting a belief in a shared understanding of justice. However, it's more likely that the symbolism was entirely for the human audience. The communities saw the hanging, the burning, the mutilation, and understood the legal and moral message being sent. The primary purpose was not to teach the pig a lesson, but to reaffirm the social order for the people watching. The animal's body became a canvas on which the community painted its definitions of crime, justice, and order. As you stand in the village, the news of the pig's sentence spreads like wildfire. The date for the execution is set for the following afternoon. There's a grim sense of purpose in the air. The local carpenter is probably already being commissioned to reinforce the gallows. The executioner, a man who normally deals with human convicts, is preparing his ropes. The sentence is not just a death warrant, it's a plan for a major civic event. The punishment had to be more than just a consequence, it had to be a spectacle. The entire village was expected to attend, to bear witness to the final, violent restoration of their broken world. The specific method, hanging, was chosen not for its efficiency, but for its powerful, terrifying, and deeply human symbolism. The afternoon of the execution arrives with a heavy, expectant air. The sky is a flat, grey canvas, draining the colour from the village and lending a sombre mood to the proceedings. Business has ground to a halt. The blacksmith's forge is cold. The market stalls are empty. This is a civic event, and attendance is not optional, it's a duty. You see families making their way towards the main square, the same place where festivals are held and public announcements are read. But today, the mood is one of grim solemnity. And this is a truly bizarre detail: people are dressed for the occasion. They are wearing their Sunday best. The men have on their cleanest tunics, the women their best-kept coifs. This isn't a mob gathering for a lynching, this is a congregation attending a formal ceremony. The act of witnessing the execution is a communal responsibility, and they are dressing to show it the proper respect. It's a public affirmation that they are all part of this legal and moral order. In the center of the square stands the gallows. It's a simple, sturdy wooden structure, dark with age and weather. A thick rope with a professionally tied noose dangles from the crossbeam, swaying slightly in the breeze. The town's official executioner stands at the ready. He is a man set apart from the rest of the community, his profession both necessary and reviled. Today, his subject is not a man, but a pig, yet he approaches the task with the same stoic professionalism. Then, the procession begins. You hear it before you see it, a slow, rhythmic drum beat, the same beat used for human condemnations. Leading the way is the prelate, holding a staff of office. Behind him, the condemned is led from the jail. The pig, panicked by the noise in the open space, is squealing and fighting against the rope. The guards struggle to keep it moving forward, and walking right alongside the pig, with a look of profound resignation on his face, is its former owner. His presence is part of the ritual, a public acknowledgement of his connection to the crime. But here is the single most surreal element of the entire spectacle, a detail documented in several historical accounts. In some cases, the condemned animal would be dressed in human clothes for its execution. The pig might be forced into a pair of breeches and a jacket. There is a famous 13 Itix case in Falaise, France, where the pig was dressed in a man's waistcoat for its trip to the gallows. This act of dressing the animal was the ultimate and most literal expression of the entire legal philosophy. By clothing the pig as a man, they were visually transforming it from a mere beast into a moral agent, a person capable of committing a human crime and therefore deserving of a human punishment. It was the final, stunning piece of theater, blurring the line between man and animal in the most unsettling way imaginable. The procession reaches the foot of the gallows. The crowd falls silent. A priest might step forward to offer a prayer, not for the soul of the pig, as animals were widely believed to have no soul to save, but for the cleansing of the community. He prays to reaffirm the divine order that was broken and is now about to be restored. Then, the court clerk steps up onto the platform and reads the verdict and sentence one last time, his voice ringing out across the silent square. The pig's crimes are recounted for all to hear. This public reading is a crucial element. Historians who study the history of punishment emphasize the communicative function of public executions. They were not just about eliminating a criminal, they were about sending a clear and terrifying message to the populace. The message here was complex. To the humans, it was a reminder of the sanctity of life and the unyielding power of the law. And, as absurd as it sounds, it was also meant as a message to the other animals. As we've touched on, legal commentators of the time, like the aforementioned Bartholomew Chasney, seriously argued for the deterrent effect of these punishments on the animal kingdom. The debate over whether this was a primary or secondary goal continues, but the belief was certainly present. Did they really think the other pigs in the village would learn a lesson it's hard for us to fathom, that in their world? It was a plausible part of the judicial logic. The executioner takes charge. With practiced efficiency, he and the guards wrestle the threshing, squealing pig onto the platform. Getting the noose around its neck is a difficult, undignified struggle, but finally, it is done. The pig stands on the platform, dressed in its human clothes, the rope around its neck, snorting in confusion and terror. The executioner checks the rope one last time. He looks to the prelate. The prelate gives a solemn nod. The mechanism is released. The platform drops. The rope goes taut. The pig's squeals are cut short with a sickening jerk. It swings silently in the air, a grotesque pendulum marking the end of the affair. A long, collective exhalation passes through the crowd. It is over. The murderer has been punished. The cosmic scales have been rebalanced. The community has faced the chaos and imposed its order upon it. They stand for a moment, watching the still film, before turning to go back to their homes. Their faces grim but resolved. The body would be left to hang for a period, a stark warning, before being cut down and buried in unconsecrated ground, or sometimes thrown into a ditch. Its flesh was unclean, its memory cursed. Justice had been served. The theater was complete. The pig's execution brings a sense of grim closure to the village. The immediate crisis is over. But the underlying legal framework that made such a trial possible wasn't limited to individual, four-legged criminals. The medieval legal mind, in its quest for total cosmic order, had to confront an even more challenging type of offender, the collective pest. What do you do when the criminal isn't a single sow, but a million locusts? What happens when your entire harvest is being devoured not by one identifiable beast, but by a silent, creeping army of caterpillars or field mice? You can't arrest them. You can't put them in a pen. And you certainly can't hang them one by one. This is where the system evolved into an even more surreal and abstract form of justice. The response to plagues of vermin shifted from the secular courts to the ecclesiastical ones. The problem was deemed too large, too widespread to be a simple matter of criminal law. A swarm of insects that could wipe out a region's food supply was seen as something more than just a nuisance. It was often interpreted as a divine punishment for the sins of the people, or worse, a direct attack orchestrated by the devil. Therefore, it was a matter for the church. The legal process began not with an arrest, but with an investigation. A formal complaint would be lodged by the afflicted villagers with the local bishop or his representative. The church would then appoint officials to go to the fields and view the damage. They would assess the extent of the infestation, collect samples of the culprits, a few weevils in a jar, perhaps, and write a formal report confirming the plague. This was the ecclesiastical equivalent of gathering evidence at a crime scene. Once the damage was confirmed, the court proceedings could begin. And this is the key point: the vermin were treated as a single legal entity, a collective defendant. A formal summons would be drawn up by the church's lawyers. This was a meticulously crafted legal document, written in Latin, addressed directly to the pests. It might begin something like, "We, the ecclesiastical court of Autun, do hereby summon you, the caterpillars, beetles, and other nefarious creatures currently laying waste to the vineyards of this parish, to appear before this court on the 3rd day of the coming week." This summons then had to be served, since you couldn't hand it to each individual caterpillar. A bizarre ritual was developed. A court official, accompanied by a priest, would go out to the afflicted fields. There, in a loud, solemn voice, he would read the summons to the empty air, to the fields and the sky, formally notifying the pests of their required court date. In some cases, copies of the summons were even posted on trees or left at the edges of the fields. They were giving the insects fair warning. Of course, on the appointed day, the courtroom would be conspicuously empty of defendants. The caterpillars did not show up. The weevils did not present themselves. This, however, did not stop the trial. Their failure to appear was duly noted by the court, and they were declared to be in contempt. The trial would then proceed in absentia. And, just like our pig, the absent swarm of insects would be appointed a defense lawyer. This is where the legal creativity reached truly stratospheric levels. A lawyer would be tasked with defending a million tiny, silent clients who had already snubbed the court. His job was to argue on their behalf, to explain their destructive behavior, and to plead for mercy. This brings us to a fascinating and slightly comical debate among religious scholars and historians of the era. Did these pests have a right to eat? Some of the arguments made by their appointed lawyers were surprisingly sophisticated. They might argue from a theological standpoint that God created all creatures, and therefore these insects, as part of God's creation, had a natural right to sustenance. One lawyer famously argued that his clients, a group of rats, were merely exercising their God-given right to survive. He might even suggest that the plague was a sign from God, a punishment for the villagers' sins, and therefore the insects were merely unwitting instruments of divine will. To punish them would be to interfere with God's plan. The prosecution, usually a representative of the church, would counter with arguments about the sanctity of human livelihood, the preservation of the Christian community, and the diabolical nature of creatures that caused famine and despair. They would frame the pests as an army of Satan, a force of chaos sent to undermine God's favored children. The court would hear these abstract theological and philosophical arguments with the same gravity as a murder trial. It was a legal battle fought entirely in the realm of ideas, over the rights and culpability of an entire species. The fate of the harvest, and the very soul of the community, hung in the balance. The courtroom drama for the pests unfolds. A surreal debate between two human lawyers over the rights and wrongs of a million tiny, absent defendants. After the arguments are heard, the ecclesiastical judge, usually a bishop or a high-ranking cleric, delivers his verdict. Unsurprisingly, the verdict is almost always guilty. The damage is real. The suffering of the community is tangible, and the theological imperative to restore order is paramount. The court finds the weevils, the locusts, or the caterpillars guilty of their crimes against the community and God. But now comes the real challenge: sentencing. You can't hang a swarm of locusts. You can't imprison a plague of field mice. The punishments had to be as abstract and symbolic as the trial itself. The church had a whole arsenal of spiritual weapons at its disposal, designed to combat this kind of intangible, demonic enemy. These sentences were not about physical retribution, but about spiritual warfare. The first and most common sentence was a formal admonition or warning. The judge would issue a decree, read aloud in the fields, giving the pests a final chance to repent and leave the parish. It was a sort of spiritual eviction notice. The decree would command them, in the name of the Father, the Son, and the Holy Spirit, to depart from the fields, vineyards, and gardens of the faithful Christians and to cease their destructive activities immediately. They were often given a specific deadline, leave within 3 days, for example, or face more severe consequences. When the pests shockingly ignored the final warning, the court would escalate. The next level of punishment was a formal malediction, or curse. This was a powerful and terrifying ritual. The priest and the villagers would march in a solemn procession around the borders of the afflicted field. They would carry crosses, holy relics, and banners. They would chant litanies and psalms, sprinkling holy water as they went. The priest would then pronounce a formal curse upon the insects, condemning them for their disobedience and wickedness. This was a direct spiritual attack, using the sacred power of the church to create a holy barrier and to wage war on the forces of darkness that the pests were believed to represent. If even the curse failed to work, the church brought out its ultimate weapon, excommunication. This is the detail that sends these trials into the realm of pure, high-concept absurdity. The bishop would issue a formal writ of anathema, the same tool used to cast out the most defiant heretics and unrepentant sinners from the church. The pests would be formally and ritually declared anathema, cut off from God's grace and protection, and eternally damned. The proclamation would be read in the church during High Mass, in the most solemn and public manner possible. We do hereby excommunicate and anathematize you, therefore said weevils, that you may have no place among the righteous. This act of excommunicating insects is a profound insight into the medieval mind. It confirms that they saw these creatures not as mindless pests, but as members, however lowly, of the great community of creation. To be excommunicated, you first have to be part of the communion. The trial and sentence were a formal process of acknowledging their membership and then ritually expelling them for their bad behavior. It was the cosmic equivalent of being kicked out of the club. Now, historians who study these ecclesiastical trials often debate their true purpose. Was this a genuine belief in the efficacy of spiritual warfare? Did the bishop and the villagers truly believe a formal curse could make the locusts fly away from many? The answer is likely yes. In a world steeped in faith, where the power of prayer, relics, and curses was considered a tangible force, these rituals were seen as a practical and powerful tool. It was applied theology. However, many scholars also point to the profound psychological function of these rituals. A plague of pests is a terrifying, uncontrollable event that can lead to famine and death. It induces a feeling of utter powerlessness. The church's remote trial provided a way for the community to do something. It gave them a script, a set of actions, and a sense of agency in the face of disaster. Marching in a procession, chanting prayers, and witnessing the formal curse was a powerful act of communal solidarity. It focused their fear, channeled their anger, and provided a sense of hope and control. Even if the weevils themselves were entirely unaffected, the trial was therapy for the humans, a way of psychologically managing an agricultural crisis. Whether the curse worked on the bugs was almost secondary to the fact that the ritual worked on the people. There is a wonderful account from the 16th century of a French village that, after a lengthy trial, offered a compromise to a plague of beetles. The townspeople, through their lawyer, formally offered the beetles a new plot of land outside the village for their own exclusive use, if they would agree to leave the village's crops alone. A deed was even drawn up. This negotiation with insects, as if they were a foreign tribe with whom one could sign a treaty, shows the incredible extent to which they were personified and integrated into the human legal and social world. The remote trial was not just a condemnation, it was a bizarre and complex form of interspecies diplomacy. The surreal world of ecclesiastical pest trials produced some of the most creative legal minds of the era. But perhaps none was more legendary than Bartholomew Chasny, active in 16th century France. Chasny was a brilliant and respected jurist who wrote extensively on law and custom. He was no fringe character, he was a serious legal scholar. But he earned his most enduring fame for his work as a defense attorney for the accused, and his most celebrated clients were a group of rats. The story, which has become a classic in the annals of legal absurdities, took place in the French town of Autun. The local citizens had brought a formal complaint to the ecclesiastical court against the rats of the district, accusing them of wantonly and maliciously destroying the barley harvest. The court, following standard procedure, summoned the rats to appear and answer for their crimes, and, following standard procedure, the rats failed to show up. The court, preparing to move towards a default judgment, appointed the young and ambitious Bartholomew Chasney to represent the absent rodents. Chasney took the appointment with the utmost seriousness and proceeded to mount a defense that was a masterclass in procedural delay and creative obstructionism. He didn't argue that the rats were innocent. Instead, he argued that the court was not playing fair. His first argument was that the initial summons was invalid. He stood before the court and argued that the summons had been too specific, addressed only to the rats of Autun. He contended that his clients were a part of a much wider community, the great commonwealth of rats, who lived throughout the diocese. The summons, he claimed, should have been a general one, read in all the parishes, because the rats were citizens of the entire region, not just one town. He argued that it was a matter of common knowledge that rats travel and intermingle. Therefore, a summons in one village was insufficient to notify all potential defendants. The court, after considering this complex jurisdictional argument, actually agreed. They ordered a second, more widespread summons to be read from the pulpits of all the surrounding churches. Weeks passed. The second summons was duly read, and on the new court date, once again, not a single rat appeared. The prosecution was furious, demanding that the court proceed immediately to a conviction. But Chasney was not finished. He rose to his feet again, his face a mask of grave concern for his client's rights. This time, he delivered his most famous and brilliant argument. He conceded that the summons had now been properly served. However, he argued, the court could not punish his clients for their failure to appear because the journey to the courthouse was simply too fraught with peril. Your Honors, he lightly argued, his voice full of feigned sincerity, my clients, the rats, are upstanding and law-abiding creatures who would dearly wish to attend this honorable court and answer the charges against them. However, the journey from their homes in the fields and barns is long and arduous, and, more importantly, it is filled with mortal danger. He then proceeded to paint a vivid picture of the gauntlet his clients would have to run. They would have to cross open field, where they would be exposed to their mortal enemies, the eagles and hawks. They would have to traverse the villages, where their arch-nemesis, the cats, lie in wait at every corner, ready to pounce. These cats, he specified, are the agents of the plaintiffs themselves. You are asking my clients to appear in a court surrounded by their sworn enemies, who seek their lives. It is a fundamental principle of law that a defendant cannot be compelled to appear if their life would be endangered by doing so. Therefore, I ask the court to grant a stay of proceedings until the plaintiffs, the villagers of Autun, can post a bond guaranteeing the safety of my clients from all feline aggression on their journey to and from this courtroom. The sheer, glorious audacity of this argument is breathtaking. He was using the court's own legal principles, the right to safe passage for a defendant, and applying them to a pack of rats. He turned the tables completely, making the villagers and their cats the source of the legal problem. The historical record of the case, primarily from Chasney's own later writings, grows a bit fuzzy on the final outcome. It seems the court was so flummoxed by this argument, so tied up in the legal knots of its own making, that the case simply fizzled out. Chasney had successfully defended his clients by making the process of trying them hopelessly complicated. He won by TKO technical knockout. Now, historians have long debated Chasney's true motives. Was he a cynical satirist, using this case to mock the entire practice of animal trials and expose their inherent absurdity? This is a popular interpretation. By taking the court's premises to their logical, ridiculous conclusion, He was holding up a mirror to the system's own folly. His defense of the rats can be read as a brilliant piece of performance art, a subtle but devastating critique from within. However, another school of thought argues that Chastney was actually a true believer in the letter of the law. In this view, he wasn't mocking the system, he was perfecting it. He believed that if the law was to be applied to animals, it must be applied with the exact same rigor, fairness, and procedural safeguards as it was to humans. His defense of the rats was a demonstration of his profound commitment to legal principle. If the court was going to treat rats as legal persons, then it had to grant them all the rights of legal persons, including the right to safe passage. In this interpretation, Chastney wasn't a satirist, he was the ultimate legal purist. The truth is probably somewhere in between. He was likely a brilliant lawyer who saw an opportunity to showcase his incredible intellect and rhetorical skill, while also having a bit of a laugh at the expense of the stuffy court officials. Regardless of his motives, the story of Bartholomew Chastney and the Rats of Otten became a legend, a high-water mark of the bizarre creativity that the world of animal trials inspired. The trials of wild pigs and swarms of rats occupied a special place in the legal landscape. But what about the animals that lived even closer to humans? What happened when the offender wasn't a feral beast or an anonymous pest, but the family dog, the loyal horse, or the purring cat by the fire? This brought a new layer of complexity to the proceedings, introducing the concept of the owner's responsibility in a way that was far more direct and personal. When a domesticated animal committed a crime, the legal system had to grapple with a thorny question: who was truly at fault? Was it the animal, acting as a malevolent agent, or was it the owner, who had failed in their duty to control their property? The answer, in many medieval legal systems, was often both. This led to a fascinating legal situation that resembles the modern concept of vicarious liability, where one person can be held responsible for the actions of another. Let's imagine a scenario. A man's dog, known for its fierce temper, bites a neighbor, causing a serious injury. The first course of action would be a suit for damages against the owner. The owner would be expected to pay for the victim's medical care for the loss of any work. This was a straightforward civil matter, a continuation of the old tradition of holding masters responsible for the trouble their animals caused. This part of the process makes perfect sense to us. However, in many places, that wasn't the end of it. If the crime was severe enough, if the dog killed someone, for example, the animal itself could still be put on trial for its own crime. This created a double jeopardy situation for the owner. Not only could they be financially ruined by civil penalties, but they also had to endure the shame and cost of having their animal criminally prosecuted. This is where a crucial distinction often came into play. Was the owner aware of the animal's vicious propensities? Court records show a great deal of attention paid to this question. Witnesses would be called to testify about the animal's past behavior. Had the dog bitten people before? Had the owner been warned about its aggressive nature? If it could be proven that the owner knew their animal was dangerous and did nothing to restrain it, their own legal culpability increased dramatically. In some cases, if an owner knowingly kept a dangerous animal that went on to kill someone, the owner could face criminal charges themselves, right alongside their pet. Now for a wonderfully specific legal detail that illustrates this shared responsibility. In some parts of Europe, there was a legal custom known as the no-exile surrender. If a man's animal or slave caused injury, he had two choices: he could pay the damages, or he could surrender the offending party, the animal or slave, to the injured family. This surrender would settle the debt. This tradition, which has its roots in Roman law, was still influential in the Middle Ages. So if your ox gored your neighbor, you could choose to either pay for his recovery or hand over the ox. This put the owner in a difficult position of making a cold, hard economic calculation: was the ox worth more or less than the damages being claimed? The trials of pets and livestock also highlight a debate that historians of emotion are very interested in. How do people in the Middle Ages really feel about their animals? We have a modern tendency to project our own feelings about pets onto the past. But while a medieval farmer certainly valued his horse or his dog, the relationship was fundamentally different. The primary bond was one of utility. The horse was for plowing, the dog for hunting or guarding. Yet, the court records sometimes hinted deeper, more complex emotional bonds. There are cases where owners clearly go to great lengths to defend their accused animals, spending money on lawyers and arguing passionately for their innocence. Was this just to protect a valuable piece of property, or was there genuine affection at play? It's impossible to know for sure. But it complicates the simple narrative that medieval animals were seen as nothing more than walking tools. The trial of a family's own animal must have been a profoundly strange and upsetting experience, a bizarre intersection of legal procedure, financial liability, and whatever personal feelings the owner had for the creature. Was it possible to love an animal that you also believed was a morally culpable murderer? The medieval mind seemed capable of holding both thoughts at once. The question of shared responsibility also applied to the sentence. If a dog was sentenced to be hanged, who paid for the executioner and the robbed the owner? Who paid for the lawyer appointed to defend the dog the owner? The financial ruin of having a pet commit a capital crime could be absolute. And after the execution, the owner was left with nothing, no dog, and a pile of debts. The system ensured that the consequences of the animal's crime radiated outwards, punishing the human responsible for it in a very real and tangible way. It was a powerful incentive for people to keep their animals under control, a lesson taught through the grim theater of the courtroom and the gallows. While the trials of pigs and dogs dealt with familiar crimes like murder and assault, there was another category of animal transgression that veered into the truly supernatural. These were cases where the animal's crime wasn't just an act of violence, but a perceived violation of the very laws of nature. And no case captures this better than the bizarre and unsettling trial of the rooster of Basel in 1474. The story begins with a strange and alarming event in the city of Basel, Switzerland. A cockerel, a rooster, was discovered to have done something profoundly unnatural. It laid an egg. In a world where the roles of every creature were seen as rigidly defined by God, this was not a quirky biological anomaly. It was a terrifying omen, an act of profound diabolical perversion. A rooster's job was to crow and to fertilize hens. A hen's job was to lay eggs. For a rooster to lay an egg was a monstrous subversion of the natural order, and the medieval mind had a very specific and sinister explanation for it. The egg of a rooster, known as a cockatrice egg, was a subject of serious dread and superstition. According to ancient legends, repeated in medieval bestiaries and folklore, a cockatrice egg, if hatched sometimes by a toad or a serpent, would produce a horrifying monster. The cockatrice was a mythical beast with the head of a rooster and the body of a dragon or serpent. Its gaze was lethal, its breath was poison, and its very existence was an affront to God. They thought. The rooster that laid the egg wasn't just a biological freak, it was a potential parent to a demonic apocalypse. It was trafficking in supernatural evil. The city authorities in Basel did not treat this as a joke or a tall tale. They treated it as a public emergency. The rooster was immediately arrested and put on trial for its life. This wasn't a standard secular court matter. Given the overt themes of witchcraft and demonic influence, it was a high-stakes theological and legal event. A full tribunal was convened, and the rooster was charged with the unnatural and heinous crime of laying an egg. The trial itself was a spectacle. The prosecution laid out its case with grim certainty. They argued that the rooster was no ordinary bird. It was clearly a demon in disguise, a fiend sent by Satan to sow chaos and bring a monster into the world. The egg itself was presented as evidence exhibit A in a case against the forces of darkness. Learned theologians worked as expert witnesses to testify about the lore of the cockatrice and the grave danger it represented. And in keeping with the bizarre logic of the system, the rooster was appointed a lawyer. An unfortunate attorney from Basel was given the seemingly hopeless task of defending a chicken accused of being a demonic agent. The lawyer, whose name is lost to history, reportedly mounted a spirited defense. He argued that there was no law in the books, divine or secular, that explicitly forbade a rooster from laying an egg. He argued that the act, while unusual, was involuntary. His client had no malicious intent. It was an act of nature, not a premeditated crime. He may have even suggested that all of God's creatures have hidden potentials. And who were they to judge this strange miracle? The core of the debate, which historians still find fascinating, was over the rooster's agency. Was the rooster an active, willing participant in a satanic plot, or was it an unwitting vessel? A pawn in a larger cosmic game. The prosecution argued for the former, claiming the rooster was a demon incarnate. The defense argued for the latter, painting the rooster as an innocent victim of its own bizarre biology. This question of intent versus act, which we saw with the pig, became even more critical here, where the crime itself was supernatural. Ultimately, the defense's arguments fell on deaf ears. The fear and superstition surrounding the cockatrice were too powerful. The court could not risk the possibility, however remote, of a monster being hatched within the city walls. The judges deliberated and returned a guilty verdict. The rooster was found guilty of being a sorcerer in the guise of a fowl, a tune of the devil. The sentence was as severe as the perceived crime. The rooster was condemned to be burned at the stake, along with its demonic egg. This punishment was highly symbolic. Hanging was for common murderers. Burning was for heretics, witches, and servants of Satan. By sentencing the rooster to the flames, the court was making a powerful theological statement. They were treating it not as a criminal animal, but as a full-blown agent of hell. The fire was meant to purify the city, to destroy the demonic vessel and its evil seed so completely that no trace could remain. A huge crowd gathered for the execution. The rooster and its egg were taken to a stake, and with great ceremony, the pyre was lit. The executioner, it is said, formally cut open the rooster's body after it was burned to prove to the crowd that there were, in fact, more eggs inside, proof of its monstrous and unnatural nature. The event was a powerful and terrifying piece of public theater, a ritual to quell a deep-seated fear. The people of Basel weren't just executing a chicken, they were fighting a tangible battle against the devil himself, and they had won. The case of the rooster of Basel remains one of the most extreme and vivid examples of how the animal trial system could merge with the darkest fears of witchcraft and demonic paranoia. We've witnessed the solemn arrests, the surreal trials, and the grim executions, but behind all this legal and theological drama, there was a much more mundane reality. Somebody had to pay for it all. An animal trial, for all its absurdity, was a surprisingly expensive undertaking. It generated a long and detailed paper trail of costs, from the first moment of the arrest to the final swing of the gallows rope. Let's pull out the medieval equivalent of a calculator and run the numbers on what it cost a community to prosecute a pig. The expenses began the moment the animal was taken into custody. As we've seen, the pig was formally imprisoned and had to be cared for. This was the first entry on the bill. The jailer wasn't running a charity. He had to be paid for his time and for the food he provided. Surviving municipal account books from 15th century France have line items that read something like, for the upkeep of the pig in jail, for 9 days, 9 souls, or for bread and water for the horse, prisoner, 3 souls. These costs could add up, especially if the defense lawyer was good at his job and managed to drag out the pre-trial period with procedural motions. Then there were the legal fees. The court officials, the judge, the prosecutor, the clerks all had to be paid for their time. While some might have been salaried employees of the local lord, special proceedings often incurred special fees. The biggest legal expense, however, could be the defense attorney, while the court appointed the lawyer. The owner of the animal was often billed for his services. If the owner was too poor, the cost would be absorbed by the town or the lord's estate. This created a situation where the public was paying to defend an animal it desperately wanted to see convicted. The costs of the trial itself were not insignificant. Scribes had to be paid for the parchment and ink used to record every word of testimony and every motion filed. Messengers had to be paid to deliver summons and other court documents. If expert witnesses were called, like the surgeon who examined the victim's wounds or the theologian who testified about the demonic nature of a rooster's egg, they expected to be compensated for their professional opinions. but the most significant expenses were often associated with the punishment, especially a public execution. An execution was a major piece of civic infrastructure. The executioner was a state-licensed professional with a fee schedule. He charged a set rate for a hanging, a different rate for a burning which required more preparation, and extra for any special services, like dressing the animal in clothes. There's a wonderfully detailed account from the 1403 execution of a pig in Paris that lists the costs item. To the executioner who hanged the said pig, 50 for sols parisis. And the costs didn't stop there. The executioner might need assistance to handle the condemned animal, and they also had to be paid. If the gallows needed repairs, the carpenter had to be hired. And then there were the props. In the case where the pig was dressed in human clothes, someone had to pay for the waistcoat and breeches. The same Parisian account notes a specific charge item for the new gloves worn by the executioner, 6 sols. Apparently, even the hangman wanted to look his best for the big day. Another account from 1390 exists for the execution of a sow in Falaise includes the cost of building a new scaffold, the executioner's fee, the price of the rope, and even the cart used to transport the pig to the gallows. When you add it all up, the jail stay, the legal fees, the court costs, and the execution itself, the total bill for prosecuting one pig could be enormous. It could easily exceed the annual income of a typical peasant family. This leads to a fascinating point that economic historians love to debate. Was this a rational allocation of resources in a world where famine was a constant threat and communities struggled for survival? Does it make economic sense to spend a fortune prosecuting a farm animal? From a modern perspective, it seems like madness. That money could have been used to repair a bridge, feed the poor, or compensate the victim's family. But that's viewing it through our own lens of economic rationality. For the medieval community, this was not a waste of money. It was an essential public expenditure, as vital as maintaining the church roof or the town walls. They were investing in the spiritual and social well-being of their community. The trial and execution were seen as a necessary ritual to restore divine favor, cleanse the town of evil, and reaffirm the rule of law. It was, in their eyes, a critical infrastructure project for maintaining cosmic order. The high cost wasn't a bug, it was a feature. It demonstrated the immense value they placed on the justice being performed. You don't skimp on the price of salvation. So while the pig's former owner was likely bankrupted by the affair, and the town's treasury was significantly lighter, no one would have stood up in a town meeting and said, "This is fiscally irresponsible." The cost was the price of security, not just from dangerous animals, but from the forces of chaos and evil that they represented. It was a tax paid to keep the universe in balance. For centuries, this bizarre and elaborate system of animal justice rolled on, a testament to a worldview where the sacred and the secular, the human and the animal, were all bound together under a single, universal law. But the world was changing, as the Middle Ages gave way to the Renaissance and then the Age of Enlightenment. New ideas began to bubble up from the intellectual ferment of Europe. A profound shift was occurring in how humanity saw itself and its place in the universe, and this would have devastating consequences for the legal rights of pigs. The single most important figure in this intellectual earthquake was the 17th century French philosopher. You probably know him for the famous phrase, "Cogito, ergo sum, I think, therefore I am." But it was another of his ideas, less famous but equally revolutionary, that would ultimately dismantle the entire philosophical foundation of animal trials. This was his theory of the animal machine. Descartes, in his quest for rational certainty, drew a sharp, absolute line between humans and animals. He argued that the defining characteristic of humanity was the soul, or the mind res cogitae tenes, which was an immaterial, thinking substance. Animals, he contended, did not possess this. They had no soul, no reason, no consciousness, and no capacity for language or thought. They were, in his view, nothing more than complex biological machines, intricate automata made of flesh and bone. Their actions were not driven by will or emotion, but by mechanical reflexes and instincts. Like a clockwork toy that moves and makes noise but has no inner life. When a dog yelped in pain, Descartes argued, it was not feeling pain in the way a human does. It was simply a mechanical reaction, like the chiming of a clock when it struck. The sounds animals made were not language, they were meaningless noises produced by their biological machinery. This idea was as radical as it was cold. It effectively stripped animals of any moral or spiritual status. They were no longer the lowly but included members of God's creation. They were objects. They were things. This animal-machine hypothesis, which became incredibly influential among Europe's intellectual elite, cut the legs out from under the entire legal basis for animal trials. If an animal is just a machine, a complex puppet without a mind or a soul, then the concepts of crime, guilt, and punishment become meaningless when applied to it. You don't put a clock on trial for chiming at the wrong hour. You don't hang a cart for rolling down a hill and causing an accident. The animal, under this new philosophy, could not form criminal intent mens rea because it had no mind to form intent with. It was incapable of being a moral agent. This new thinking began to spread from philosophicals into the legal and judicial worlds. Educated judges and lawyers, increasingly influenced by Cartesian rationalism, started to view the old traditions with embarrassment and skepticism. The idea of appointing a lawyer for a pig, which had once been a serious legal duty, now seemed like a foolish relic of a superstitious and ignorant past. This philosophical shift coincided with other major changes in society. The rise of modern science offered new, biological explanations for animal behavior, replacing the old theological and demonic ones. A rooster laying an egg was no longer a sign of a satanic plot, it was a hormonal anomaly, a subject for scientific curiosity, not a court of law. The world was becoming disenchanted, stripped of its old spiritual and supernatural dimensions. André explained through the cold, hard lens of reason and empirical observation. But the tradition of animal trials didn't die overnight. This is a point that social historians find fascinating. New, elite ideas can take a very long time to filter down and change the beliefs and practices of the general population, while the philosophers in Paris were debating the nature of the animal soul. Peasants in a remote village in the Alps might still be fully convinced that their crops were being destroyed by a demonic swarm of caterpillars that needed to be excommunicated. There was a significant lag between the intellectual revolution and the death of the old folkways. The debate over Descartes' theory was fierce. Many other thinkers, both thin and no, have challenged his cold, mechanical view of animals. They argued that anyone who has ever lived with a dog knows that it is more than just a machine. They pointed to the clear evidence of animal emotion, intelligence, and even problem-solving. This debate over animal consciousness, what they feel, what they know, and what our moral obligations are to them is, in many ways, the direct legacy of the questions first raised by Descartes. We are still wrestling with the philosophical problems he created. So, while the pig in its sty had no idea who Descartes was, his ghost was slowly but surely marching across Europe, dismantling the legal and spiritual world that had given it the right to a fair trial. The pig was losing its soul, its moral standing, and its place in the great chain of being. It was on its way to becoming what it is to many of us today, a source of bacon, not a potential defendant. The age of reason was dawning, and it was a dark day for the legal rights of animals. The seeds of doubt planted by Descartes and other Enlightenment thinkers began to sprout, not just in scholarly texts, but in the very heart of the legal system. The 18th century saw a dramatic shift in tone. What was once treated with solemn gravity was now increasingly becoming a source of public ridicule and intellectual scorn. The animal trial, once a pillar of justice, was becoming a laughingstock. This mockery often came from the top down. The most influential voices of the Enlightenment, the philosophers of France like Voltaire and Diderot, were masters of satire. They saw the lingering traditions of animal trials as a perfect example of the foolishness and superstition of the Dark Ages they so despised. They wielded wit and sarcasm like a weapon. writing essays and encyclopedia entries that held the practice up to the harsh light of reason and found it utterly ridiculous. Voltaire, in his famous philosophical dictionary, wrote about the animal trials with dripping contempt. He recounted the stories of lawyers defending rats and insects being excommunicated, not as interesting legal history, but as proof of the backwardness of a world ruled by priests and feudal lords. He mocked the solemnity with which these animals were treated, as if they were on par with humanity, and used it as a club to beat the old regime in the church. For him, the trials were not just silly, they were a symptom of a dangerously irrational society. This intellectual assault had a profound effect on the legal profession. Judges and lawyers, who wanted to be seen as modern, rational, and enlightened men, grew increasingly embarrassed by these old customs. To preside over an animal trial was no longer a sign of one's piety and commitment to order, it was a sign that you were a provincial bumpkin, out of step with the times. The social pressure to abandon the practice mounted. You can almost picture the scene in a provincial courthouse. A group of villagers comes forward with a complaint about a plague of locusts, demanding the traditional ecclesiastical trial. By 100 years earlier, the bishop would have begun the proceedings immediately. Now, the judge, a man who has read his Voltaire and wants a promotion to a court in Paris, sighs wearily. He can't simply ignore the villagers' demands, which are still rooted in local custom and genuine belief. But he also can't bring himself to appoint a lawyer for a swarm of insects without feeling like a complete fool. This tension between old folk beliefs and new elite rationalism created a strange, transitional period. The trials didn't just stop, they faded away in a haze of absurdity and embarrassment. This is a key historical point. Major social changes rarely happen like flipping a switch. They happen through a slow, awkward, and often comical process of negotiation and decay. We see evidence of this in the changing nature of the trials themselves. The later cases often have a half-hearted, almost farcical quality to them. There's a famous story of a 17th century case against a group of sparrows that were fouling a church. The birds were tried, found guilty, and sentenced to exile. That the court, perhaps with a sense of the ridiculousness of it all, included a clause in the sentence specifying that young, elderly, and infirm sparrows would be exempt from the banishment on humanitarian grounds. This blend of formal legal procedure with such a silly, tender-hearted exception shows a system that is starting to laugh at itself. Another fascinating detail from this period is the rise of the mock trial. Animal trials became a subject for popular plays, poems, and satirical pamphlets. They moved from the courtroom to the stage, where their inherent absurdity could be played for laughs. This was a way for society to process and discard the old tradition. By turning it into entertainment, they were robbing it of its power and legitimacy. Historians who study this decline face a specific challenge: the records themselves become less reliable. As officials became more embarrassed by the practice, they became less likely to document it with the old meticulous care. The trials may have continued in remote, rural areas for quite some time, but they went off the books. This creates a debate among scholars about when the practice truly ended. Was the last trial the last one officially recorded? Or did they persist as informal folk rituals long after the legal elite had washed their hands of them? It highlights the gap that can exist between the formal, written law and the living customs of a people. The result of all this mockery and skepticism was the final legal evolution on the matter. The law began to formally separate humans and animals. New legal codes, like the Napoleonic Code in the early 19th century, were written with a clear, rationalist framework. They made no provision for animal defendants. A crime could only be committed by a human being. An animal that caused harm was now treated as a simple property issue. The owner was liable for the damages, and the animal could be put down as a public safety measure. There was no trial, no lawyer, no sentence. The process became administrative, not judicial. The strange and wonderful legal personhood of the animal was officially revoked. The laughter of the Enlightenment had proven to be a more effective executioner than any gallows. The 18th century was the long, slow twilight of the animal trial, but the practice died a stubborn death. Like a great fire dwindling to embers, it continued to flare up in isolated pockets, mostly in rural areas far from the fashionable skepticism of the cities. Finding the very last animal trial is a bit like trying to find the last person who truly believed the world was flat. It's a fuzzy and disputed endpoint. However, historical records allow us to identify some of the final, documented cases, the last gasps of a dying tradition. One of the last widely cited secular trials took place, fittingly, in France, the heartland of the practice, in 1740. A cow was tried and executed for the crime of killing a person. The records show that the proceedings followed the old formula. The cow was arrested, tried with legal counsel, found guilty, and sentenced to be hanged. But the very fact that this case was remarkable enough to be documented and commented on shows how rare it had become. It was seen as a strange throwback, a relic from a bygone age. The final battles, however, were mostly fought in the ecclesiastical courts. The belief that pests were a divine punishment or a demonic horde proved to be more resilient than the belief in the individual criminality of a pig. The church's rituals were deeply embedded in the agricultural rhythms of rural life, and villagers continued to appeal to their priests for help against plagues long after secular courts had abandoned animal prosecutions. One of the last major ecclesiastical cases on record occurred in the late 18th century in the Papal States of Italy. A community was suffering from a plague of voracious caterpillars. They turned to the church, which, after some apparent reluctance, agreed to hear the case. The whole elaborate theater was performed one more time. The caterpillars were summoned, a lawyer was appointed to defend them, and theological arguments were made on both sides. The lawyer, in a final echo of Bartholomew Chasney, argued that his clients were God's creatures and had a right to their sustenance. The court eventually came to a compromise, attempting to broker a deal where the caterpillars would be allocated a specific patch of land to live on. The outcome feels less like a solemn verdict and more like an exasperated attempt by the church to appease the villagers without fully committing to the old ways. Perhaps the very last officially recorded animal execution in Europe took place in a Swiss village in the canton of Appenzell in the 1782. The case involved a dog that had attacked and fatally wounded a child. In a stark departure from the new rationalist legal codes being adopted elsewhere, the Swiss village clung to its ancient customs. The dog was put on trial, found guilty, and sentenced to death. The sentence was carried out, a final, lonely echo of a tradition that had once spanned a continent. Why did the practice hold on for so long in these isolated, often mountainous regions like Switzerland and parts of Italy? Historians suggest a few reasons. These areas were often more culturally conservative and less touched by the new ideas spreading from urban centers. Their economies were or directly and precariously tied to agriculture, making them more susceptible to the anxieties of crop failure and pestilence. And their folk beliefs, which had been intertwined with the official legal and religious systems for centuries, simply had deeper roots. The Enlightenment took longer to climb the mountains. The debate over the last trial is, in itself, an interesting historical exercise. Does the end come when the last formal record is written, or does it end when the belief system that supported it finally dies? There are anecdotal accounts and folkloric tales of informal trials and curses being carried out against animals and pests well into the 19th century. A farmer whose cow repeatedly breaks a fence might have formally banished it from his property in front of his family, a private, small-scale version of the old public rituals. These events would never make it into a court record, but they show the persistence of the underlying worldview. As the 19th century dawned, the animal trial was, for all intents and purposes, dead. It had been killed by a combination of philosophical revolution, scientific discovery, and public ridicule. It now belonged to the history books. A bizarre footnote in the story of Western law. The legal system had drawn a firm, clear line. Humans were subjects of the law. Animals were objects. The world was now neatly, rationally, and perhaps a little less magically, divided. The courts fell silent. The animal lawyers hung up their robes. The gallows were now reserved exclusively for men, a privilege the animals had, at long last, lost. The final embers of this strange legal fire had finally gone cold, leaving behind only the faintest wisp of smoke and a collection of unbelievable stories. The book is closed on animal trials, the formal practice relegated to the dusty archives of legal history. It seems like a completely sealed chapter, a bizarre detour on the road to modern, rational jurisprudence. But is it if you look closely at our own legal system? At the way we talk about and legislate for animals today, you can find faint, ghostly echoes of that old medieval worldview. The ideas that underpinned animal trials didn't vanish completely, they mutated, transformed, and resurfaced in new and sometimes surprising forms. The most direct and obvious legacy is in the laws concerning dangerous animals. When a dog bites someone today, what happens? There's a formal investigation. Authorities are called. They gather evidence, including witness testimony and the animal's history of aggression. The animal may be quarantined or impounded, a modern, sanitary term for the same jailing our medieval pig endured, and there is a formal hearing to determine the animal's fate. A judge or an administrative panel will decide if the animal is to be declared vicious and, in many cases, sentenced to be euthanized. Now, we are very careful to say that this is not a trial. The dog is not a defendant. It is an administrative procedure to ensure public safety. But look at the structure. It's a formal process, with evidence, testimony, and a judicial figure making a life or death decision about an animal based on its past actions. While we've stripped away the language of guilt and sin, the underlying framework of a formal hearing to judge an animal's behavior is a direct descendant of the process we've been exploring. We may have replaced the executioner's noose with a veterinarian's needle, but the end result for the animal is the same. Another fascinating echo can be found in the legal concept of animal cruelty. For most of history, cruelty to an animal wasn't a crime in itself. An animal was property. You could damage your own property if you wanted to. But, in the 19th century, a new type of law emerged, the anti-cruelty statute. These laws made it illegal to inflict unnecessary suffering upon an animal. This was a revolutionary idea. For the first time, the law was concerned not just with the animal's owner or public safety, but with the animal's own experience. The law was recognizing that animals could suffer, and that this suffering had moral and legal weight. This is, in a way, a partial rejection of Descartes' animal-machine theory. The law is implicitly stating that animals are not just clockwork things, they are sentient beings whose feelings matter. This re-endows them with a kind of moral status. And here's the debate that connects back to our medieval story. Where does this status come from? Are we protecting animals for their own sake, because they have an intrinsic right not to suffer, or are we outlawing cruelty because it is seen as brutalizing and degrading to the humans who inflict it, making society more violent and coarse? This is a live debate in legal philosophy today. Animal rights advocates argue for the former, that animals have inherent rights. Others argue for the latter, that anti-cruelty laws are really about preserving human morality. This argument mirrors the old debate about the purpose of animal trials. Were they for the sake of the animal's soul, or for the sake of the community's spiritual health? The question of whether our laws are animal-centric or human-centric is a modern echo of that same fundamental uncertainty. A more whimsical, but still telling, modern parallel can be seen in things like pet trusts and pet custody battles. Wealthy individuals can now leave fortunes in a legally binding trust for the care of their beloved cat or dog. In divorce cases, judges are sometimes asked to decide not who owns the dog, but what custody arrangement is in the best interest of the pet. In these instances, the law is treating the animal not as a piece of property like a toaster or a sofa, but as something more, a being with interests that the law must consider. While we stop short of granting them full legal personhood, we are creeping closer, creating a special legal category for them that is neither person nor property. This is a faint but clear echo of the medieval willingness to grant animals a unique place within the legal system. So while we no longer put pigs on trial or excommunicate caterpillars, the questions raised by those strange proceedings have never really gone away. What is the moral and legal status of an animal? What duties do we owe them when they cause harm? What is a just and rational response? We may have swapped our theological framework for a scientific and administrative one, but we are still drawing lines, holding hearings, and wrestling with the profound and complex relationship between human justice and the animal world. The ghosts of the pig, the rooster, and the rats of autumn are still quietly haunting our courtrooms. So here we are. We've walked through the mud of a medieval village, sat through a surreal courtroom drama, and witnessed a pig in a waistcoat meet its end at the gallows. We've seen the law applied to everything from rats to roosters. And after all this, the biggest question still hangs in the air. Heavier than any executioner's rope. Why were they so serious about it all from our modern perch? The whole enterprise looks like a massive, tragic, and expensive joke. But they weren't laughing. They were deadly serious. To understand why, we need to stop looking at the individual, absurd details, and instead look at the very foundation of their reality. First, and most importantly, we have to understand their concept of cosmic order. For the medieval mind, the universe was not a random collection of atoms. It was a single, unified, and deeply meaningful creation, often visualized as the great chain of being. In this vast hierarchy, everything had its God-given place. God was at the top, followed by the angels, then humanity with its own internal hierarchy of kings, nobles, and peasants, then animals, then plants, and finally, inanimate rocks. Every single thing was a link in this chain. The crucial part of this belief is that these links were not just about power, they were about purpose and duty. A king's duty was to rule justly, a peasant's duty was to farm, and a pig's duty was, well, to be a proper pig, to root, to eat, to fatten up, and not to murder human children. When a pig killed a child, it wasn't just a tragic accident, it was a metaphysical crisis. A link in the great chain had shattered. The pig had acted outside of its God-given nature, creating a tear in the very fabric of reality. This act of transgression introduced chaos and evil into the world. The trial, therefore, was not primarily about punishing a pig. It was an act of cosmic repair. The solemn rituals, the legal formalism, the public execution, all of it was a meticulously choreographed ceremony designed to mend that tear, to eject the chaos, and to restore the integrity of God's perfect chain. They were so serious because they believed they were doing God's work, tidying up the universe. Second, their seriousness stemmed from a profound and almost obsessive reverence for the law itself. Medieval society was built on a complex and overlapping tapestry of legal systems: ancient Roman law, local Germanic customs, and the all-encompassing canon law of the Church. A key intellectual project for the scholars of the age was to harmonize these systems and prove that human law was a direct reflection of divine law. They believed their legal procedures were a sacred technology for discerning truth and enacting justice on earth. This is where we find a niche, but crucial, detail. The animal trials were the ultimate stress test for this belief. If their legal system was truly universal, a reflection of God's own justice, then it must apply to all of God's creation. To make an exception for animals would be to admit that their system was flawed, that it was merely a human invention and not a divine one. So, when they appointed a lawyer for a pig, they weren't just being silly, they were demonstrating their system's majestic consistency. The very absurdity was, to them, proof of the law's universal power. And this is where we come to the central debate that historians and anthropologists still grapple with today. Was this all a sign of a highly sophisticated, if alien, legal and theological mind at work, or was it a form of collective ritual to manage deep-seated psychological anxieties? The first view holds that they were rational actors within their own belief system. The second, more psychological view, suggests the trials were a coping mechanism. Life in the Middle Ages was brutal, short, and terrifyingly random. famine, disease, and violence were ever present. A child's death could be a meaningless, horrifying accident. But the human mind abhors a vacuum of meaning. The animal trial was a way to take a random, chaotic event and force it into a structured, understandable narrative. The narrative went like this: crime, investigation, trial, punishment, resolution. It transformed the terrifying randomness of nature into a manageable legal problem. It gave the community a sense of agency. They couldn't stop death, but they could identify a culprit, hold a trial, and perform a public execution. It provided a scapegoat or a scape pig for their fear and grief. So were these trials about justice for the animal, or therapy for the humans? Were they mending the cosmos, or just mending their own terrified minds? The answer is likely all of the above. Their seriousness came from the fact that at this one bizarre point, their deepest theological beliefs, their most cherished legal theories, and their most profound psychological needs all converged. The trial of the pig was the place where the great chain of being, the majesty of the law, and the desperate need to control a chaotic world all met. It wasn't funny to them because it was the most important work they could do. Let's try one last thought experiment. For this whole journey, you've been a human observer, watching these strange events unfold from a safe, modern distance. But now, let's shift our perspective. Just for a moment, let's try to see this all from the other side. Let's try to imagine what it was like for the pig. Of course, this is an impossible task. We can never truly know the mind of another creature. But by using empathy and a little imagination, we can try to peel back the layers of human ritual and see the raw, bewildering experience at its core. You are not a legal entity. You are not a moral agent. You are a creature of instinct and sensation. Your world is a rich tapestry of smells. The sweet rot of fallen apples, the sharp tang of urine in the straw, the comforting, earthy smell of mud, the familiar scent of the humans who bring you food. Your reality is a cycle of hunger and satisfaction, of warmth and cold, of the push and shove of other bodies in the sty. Your memory is not a narrative, but a collection of strong associations. This sound means food. That touch means danger. This smell means comfort. One day, your world is shattered. There is a commotion. A small, loud human is in your space. There is confusion, a flurry of movement, perhaps a feeling of being cornered or threatened. There is a sharp, metallic smell of blood, which is both alarming and strangely interesting. Then there are screams. The sound is a new one, high and piercing, and it signals that something is deeply wrong. The familiar scents of the village are now mixed with the new, sharp smell of human fear. Then, the larger humans come. They do not bring food. Their movements are not the familiar, routine gestures of fading time. They are slow, deliberate, and menacing. They invade your space. They rope. A thing you associate with being pulled and controlled is forced over your head. You panic. You do what any cornered creature would do. You fight. You squeal. You try to escape, but they are stronger. You are dragged through the village. The familiar ground, the familiar smells, are all a blur of terror. You are forced into a new space, a small, dark, cold place. The floor is hard stone, not soft mud. The air is stale and dead. There are no other pigs, no comforting warmth of other bodies. You are alone. Periodically, a human appears and gives you food and water, but the interaction is brief and without the usual context. The rhythms of your life have been broken. There is only confusion and a low, constant hum of stress. Then you are taken out again, not back to the familiar sty, but to another enclosed space filled with humans. They are all staring at you. The air is thick with their scent, their breath, their focused attention. It is overwhelming. Loud noises come from their mouths. Sometimes they point at you. You have no framework to understand this. It is a sensory assault. You retreat into instinct. You try to make yourself small. You try to find a corner. You sniff the ground, looking for something familiar. something understandable in this barrage of meaningless stimuli. Eventually, the stress and confusion are so great that your body simply shuts down. You sleep. It is your only defense. This, from the pig's perspective, is the trial. It is not a legal proceeding. It is a series of terrifying, incomprehensible events. The lawyer's arguments, the judge's pronouncements, they are just sounds, vibrations in the air, no more meaningful than the cawing of crows or the rumble of thunder. The entire elaborate structure of human justice is, to you, a chaotic and threatening sensory overload. And this brings us to a final, poignant question for historical debate. Did any of the human participants ever try to see it from the animal's point of view? The legal framework, of course, was built on the premise that the animal did have a form of understanding. But on a personal, human level, did the lawyer, the judge, or the jailer ever look at the terrified, confused creature before them and feel a pang of empathy? Did they ever momentarily see not a murderer, but a bewildered animal caught in a human machine it could never comprehend? The historical record is mostly silent on this. It is a record of human thoughts, human laws, and human anxieties. The animal's own experience is a blank page, but it's hard to believe that in all those centuries, no one ever felt a flicker of doubt, a moment of pity for the sheer, unconfronted terror of their four-legged defendant. The seriousness of their ritual depended on their ability to not see the animal this way. They had to see a criminal, a monster, a demon. If they allowed themselves to see just a pig, a scared, stupid, and profoundly innocent pig, the whole majestic, terrible, and absurd theater would have collapsed into a puddle of mud. And so, the memory fades. The gallows in the town square is eventually dismantled. It would repurposed for a fence or a pigsty, the irony lost on everyone. The court records, written in fading ink on brittle parchment, are filed away in a dusty archive in a provincial church, forgotten for centuries. The story of the pig that went to court becomes a strange and unbelievable tale told by grandparents to their grandchildren. Can you believe they used to do that anecdote that grows more fantastical with each telling? The visceral reality of it, the grief, the fear, the solemnity is smoothed over by time, leaving only the absurdity. You find yourself standing on that same village green, centuries later. The wattle and dub huts are gone, replaced by sturdy stone and brick houses. The muddy track is a paved road. The air no longer smells of wood smoke and livestock, but of car exhaust and cut grass. The animals are gone. They are no longer your neighbors. They are neatly packaged products in a refrigerated aisle. Their lives and deaths happening far away, out of sight and out of mind. The chaotic, intimate, and often brutal coexistence has been replaced by a clean, sterile, and profound separation. Looking back at that world of animal trials, it's easy for us to feel smug. We see that world as superstitious, ignorant, and cruel. We pride ourselves on our rationality, our science, our enlightened understanding of animal behavior. We would never put a pig on trial. We know better. But do we? The core of the animal trials was society's attempt to answer a fundamental question: how do we, as humans, justly manage our relationship with the non-human world? Especially when that world harms us or our interests, we are still asking that same question. We just use a different vocabulary. When a shark attacks a swimmer, we talk about culling problem sharks. When deer destroy crops, we have management programs and harvesting quotas. When a new virus jumps from an animal to a human, we launch massive scientific and governmental responses. These are our modern, secular rituals for restoring order. They are cloaked in the language of science, public health, and resource management, just as the medieval rituals work in a language of law and theology. But the underlying impulse is the same: to confront a threat from the natural world, to impose human control upon it, and to restore our sense of safety and dominance. We may not sentence the shark in a courtroom, but we hold a hearing of public opinion and scientific debate that often leads to a death sentence just the same. And this brings us to the final, lingering debate for historians and philosophers. by stripping animals of their old legal personhood. Did we lose something important? The medieval system, for all its madness, operated on a belief that animals were part of our moral and legal community. They were the lowliest members, to be sure, but they were included. They had a place. Our modern system, in its cold rationality, has made them objects, property, resources. We have anti-cruelty laws, but they are a shield to protect animals from us. They are no longer participants with us in a shared world. We have, in a sense, excommunicated the entire animal kingdom. The great irony is that the medieval peasant, who lived cheek by jowl with his pig, who might one day see it hanged for a crime, arguably had a more intimate, if more brutal, relationship with that animal than we do with the animals that provide our food. His pig was a character in his life's drama. Our pig is an abstraction, a number in an industrial system. So as you stand here, in the quiet, modern village, the story of the animal trials serves as a strange and unsettling mirror. It reflects a world that is undeniably foreign and bizarre, but it also reflects our own struggles, our own anxieties, and our own attempts to impose human order on a world we still don't fully control. The story began with a scream in a muddy village, a moment of chaos, and it ends here, in the quiet hum of modernity, with the same fundamental questions about justice, order, and our place among the other creatures of this planet. The questions are just quieter now, but they have not gone away. And so, the story comes to a close. The courtroom is empty now, the echoes of the strange proceedings having long since faded into the stone walls. The village square is quiet, the shadows of the gallows replaced by the gentler shade of an old tree. The world has moved on, tucking away this bizarre chapter of its past like a strange dream one can barely recall upon waking. You can feel the edges of that world softening now, the crisp details of the story dissolving into the warm, quiet haze of impending sleep. The scent of wood smoke and damp earth gives way to the familiar comfort of your own room. The weight of history lifts, leaving behind only a gentle sense of wonder, a quiet murmur in the back of your mind. The urgent questions about justice and order seem less pressing now, their sharp edges smoothed away by the gentle rhythm of your breathing. You are drifting now, on a slow, quiet river of thought, away from the past and into the boundless, peaceful landscape of your own dreams. The stern face of the judge, the frantic squeals of the pig, the earnest arguments of the lawyer, they are all just shapes in the mist now, figures in a story that has been told. Let the current carry you. There are no more trials to witness, no more verdicts to hear. There is only the stillness of the night, the soft hum of the fan, and the deep, restorative promise of sleep. Let the story settle, like dust on an ancient book, and allow yourself to drift away. The end of the article. Good night.